Alright, so I thought about making some videos about some of the most legendary motherboards of all time in the whole history of PCs, which are important to me and which I have been able to gather or collect during all these years. And I thought about starting with the Gigabyte GA-EP45T-Extreme. The T stands for DDR3, so this is a DDR3 based P45 chipset motherboard that was released for the 775 socket back in 2008. So why is this motherboard important? Why does it have a big value in the world of overclocking? So the whole motherboard or platform scene differed a bit back in 2008 and during 775 days compared to platforms of today. So since the release of Intel's X58 platform, the high-end extreme CPUs and the whole high-end enthusiast platform was separated from the mainstream platform when the 1366 or X58 platform came out in very late 2008. So since then all the X CPUs with black stickers have been always on the enthusiast platform, and the mainstream platform continued on its own with the 1156 or P55 CPUs. Then came the original Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge, Haswell, and so on. But back in 2008 and before that, both the mainstream platform as well as the enthusiast high-end platform existed on the same socket, so on the 775 socket. The P45 was the last mainstream sort of chipset for that platform, and the X48 was the last enthusiast or high-end chipset or for the 775 platform, which could be considered like the high-end enthusiast platform. They didn't differ that much from their prior versions, so the P45 was very similar to P35 in many ways. So the only real difference was pretty much the standard support for PCI Express 2.0, but nothing really else than that. And X48 is also very similar to X38 in many ways, so or they are pretty much the same. So what's the difference in overclocking? So the enthusiast chipset, or X48, which is the chipset that the most famous 775 motherboard, the Asus Rampage Extreme, has, is pretty much better performing in every way. The only real difference between the two is that the mainstream chipset, or P45 in this case, can overclock the frontside bus or the FSB much higher in general than the enthusiast chipset X48 or X38. So some of the most locked CPUs, especially the low-end Wolfdale CPUs, couldn't get the best possible CPU core frequencies on the X48 because they are mostly limited on FSB. So pretty much the most notable CPU ever on the P45 chipset was the legendary entry-level Wolfdale CPU, the E8400, which had a locked multiplier of 9. Also the E8500, which had a locked multiplier of 9.5, was very important on this platform. So especially the E8400, it could not reach anywhere near the highest core frequencies on X48 because it requires well over 700 on frontside bus. And I personally happen to own one of the world's best, if not the world's best, Rampage Extreme motherboards, which was originally given to the famous and now retired overclocker from Finland, SF3D. That Rampage Extreme was able to push the frontside bus to 710 for CPU-Z validation when the CPU was on LM2, the E8600 CPU, and the North Bridge part was on chilled water. So that is a huge result for X48. But P45 chipset, especially this motherboard here, can push frontside bus even higher than that. So the best E8400 results on CPU-Z validation and SuperPi 1M were done with the frontside bus running at like 720, and well, the validation was even higher. And I think the highest ever validation on any motherboard when it comes to the reference clock or base clock or frontside bus is around 750 or so. So the only difference really is just on the frontside bus, but that doesn't mean that the mainstream chipset is faster than the enthusiast chipset, or like, I mean, in this example that P45 would be faster than X48, even though P45 can reach a higher frontside bus. So I did some tests myself when I compared the two platforms against each other using the same CPU and same memories, when of course taking into account that X48 can overclock memories much higher. But I used the same exact memory kit and tried to run the best possible memory configuration as I was able to achieve. And if we look at these two screenshots here, I first ran the X48 platform, or the Rampage Extreme, with the CPU running at 4.5 GHz with memories running at 2000 MHz 675 timings, which are really tight timings for DDR3. Those are very cherry-picked LP to hyper based DDR3 memories. And when I compared that against the P45, this particular motherboard here, the overall result in SuperPi 32M was still so much worse, even when the CPU was running almost 200 MHz higher. So when it comes to SuperPi 32M or any like real like hard program that really requires memory bandwidth overall, the P45 requires a CPU core frequency overhead of at least 500 to 600 MHz. So that is a huge difference compared to platforms of today. So in that same test, so in SuperPi 32M, I would have had to run the Wolfdale CPU at least around 5 GHz to 5.1 GHz in order to have any chance against the X48 rig. So that is a huge difference, and that is one of the reasons why many people compare, or I mean, how is there any sense to invest money in a motherboard in 2019 compared to 2008, when we talk about motherboards, the main differences are mostly on the VRMs and in connectivity things, or in just overall motherboard layout and BIOS. Back then, the North Bridge part contained many features that now reside inside the CPU itself, particularly the memory controller that now exists inside the CPU itself since the release of X58. It was actually located in the North Bridge of the motherboard, in the memory controller hub. It was called that back in those days, not as IMC. So the motherboard decided which memory type you could run. So you could even place the oldest possible 775 CPU, technically, that was ever released for that platform from like 2004 or early 2005. Place it inside this, in this motherboard, and you could run that CPU with DDR3 memories, even though DDR3 was initially launched in 2007, although it didn't come very popular until the release of X58. It was very expensive in the start, and the stock configuration of DDR3 wasn't actually that good compared to the highest end DDR2 options on the market. So the stock configuration of DDR3 was 1333 MHz with LGA775 timings with a stock voltage of 1.5. And there were some really high-end DDR2 kits out there back in those days with like 1050 MHz, 1150 MHz or 1200 MHz with 555 timings. Of course the memory voltage was high, like 2 volts or even 2.1 volts, but that was of course faster than the stock configuration of DDR3. But then of course there were better options or even on the DDR3 market, so like 1800, 888 timings and even with 777 timings when we talk about those very old D9 Micron chips. They had very high stock rated voltage, like even 2 volts, which many people would consider extremely high for DDR3, but back then it was actually safe to run so high voltages for the memory, because the memory controller was inside the North bridge and it was much more durable than the earliest integrated memory controllers of Intel CPUs. So when the X58 was launched and also the P55, the common maximum value of 1.65 was pretty much introduced around that point, because in order to have the best stability on X58 when it comes to memory overclocking, you would have to maintain some sort of voltage delta between the actual memory voltage and the IMC voltage. And if you wanted to run those 2 volt kits on that platform for daily, you would have to run the IMC voltage or the VTT at least at a value of 1.5 or even higher. So running extremely high voltage on the memory could actually damage the CPU itself, and that was the reason why people saw those warning messages in the motherboard BIOSes and so on, that running memory voltage of or in excess of 1.65 could damage the CPU permanently. So that's kind of funny trademark, that running very high voltage on the memory is actually not so risky for the memory itself, but actually for the CPU. So that is the reason why the 1.65 limit came to many memory kits. Only really the earliest core series Intel CPUs had a very kind of weak IMC that could actually get damaged from a very high memory voltage. But after Sandy Bridge, so when Ivy Bridge came out and Haswell, it came a bit better, so running memory voltage was actually safer at that point compared to the very earliest core series CPUs like the Bloomfield Core i7-920 or the other CPUs that came around that mark. Also, when comparing the two platforms, so P45 and X48, was that the mainstream chipset could not run memories that high, as I already mentioned briefly. So this motherboard states that it can run memories up to 1900 MHz with just OC marking at the end. I personally was never really able to push dual-sided memories like LPDA hyper-based memories above 700 or 750 MHz. I think the 1900 MHz is possible with single-sided DDR3 sticks. Like the earliest very high-end DDR3 kits were pretty much single-sided microns that had the very high stock voltage or rated voltage of like 1.8 or even 2 volts. So with those sticks you can probably run even 1900 MHz if you have a really good kit. They are 1 GB sticks, of course, but you could run that if you wanted to. But also the other big negative side effect of the mainstream chipset is that it is usually only restricted to command rate 2, so it cannot run command rate 1 compared to how well the X48 can run that on the memories. So the difference is quite big. The highest I've been able to run on X48 or Rampage Extreme has been just over 2150 MHz with 675 timings, and that is with command rate 1, and around 1700 to 1750 on this motherboard here with 675 or 665 timings, and that is with command rate 2. So that is one of the key differences there. But as I already mentioned about the North Bridge and how most of the features of today actually resided or actually were located on the motherboard. It wasn't just the memory controller, also some parts like iGPU didn't exist inside the CPUs back then, so only the like low-end variations of the mainstream platform had graphics controller placed on the motherboard, and those motherboards did have some display output options at the rear I/O. But of course, this one here was around 300 euros when it came out, so it wasn't really expected that you would run integrated graphics on a motherboard like this. So it was assumed that you would run at least a single good graphics card. So this motherboard here does not have the so-called iGPU, it's called iGPU now when it's inside the CPU. But anyways, you could almost say that the North Bridge of those days is almost like a secondary CPU in today's standards. So there was real reason to invest money on a motherboard back in those days, as the X48 is just so much faster at the hardware level compared to P45, even when everything is at stock and they both run at the same values on paper. The X48 is just so much faster on any program that requires a lot of memory bandwidth and not just pure CPU calculation power like W prime or similar. So if you plan to build any like retro PC or a nostalgia PC, I would not even consider a P45 motherboard, just because the X48 is just so much faster. When I already showed the 500 to 600 MHz difference in order to obtain the same performance of X48. So the P45 is just for pure clock speed validations on very locked CPUs like the entry-level Wolfdale E8400. So that's pretty much it. That is the only real value of this particular motherboard here. I never personally really liked it. The highest frontside bus I was able to achieve on this motherboard was 660. No matter what I did, I could never push the frontside bus above 660, even when I tried to run the North Bridge part on LN2 as well, not just the CPU. So this motherboard isn't so big thing for me compared to the Rampage Extreme. I happen to own two Rampage Extreme as well as an X48 Asus workstation board, so I would rather stick to those compared to this. But this has its place in the history of overclocking. It has a huge value to some 775 enthusiasts, because this is in the end required for the best possible scores with E8400 or similar CPUs when we talk about CPU-Z validations, SuperPi 1M, or tests like W prime. SuperPi 1M doesn't really require that much memory because it's so fast, but SuperPi 32M and even PiFast, those are very memory dependent as well, so they will get the best performance in the end on X48. So that's pretty much it. And also one small little plus for P45 is that it has better compatibility with those LGA775 Xeon CPUs compared to X48, so you can run a larger number of those CPUs on this particular motherboard compared to Rampage Extreme, for example. So you can run the most performing quad-core Xeons on this particular motherboard here that were released to the LGA775, but that doesn't really change that much, as you can run exactly the same desktop versions of those CPUs on Rampage Extreme, for example the QX9770, and you still have the better performance of X48 and better memory overclocking options. So it's still a better option to just get a very nice X48 rig compared to P45. So yeah, the EP45T-Extreme is definitely one of the strongest P45 motherboards that were ever released to the 775 platform. It is quite strong. It has very strong power delivery compared to the motherboards of that era. So we can just go through, and and it also has quite decent connectivity options. So we can just briefly go through the motherboard and have a little overview. So the motherboard has blue colored PCB. It might not look so nice compared to the very high-end motherboards of today, but back in those days the motherboards were always kind of huge mix of colors. They weren't so beautiful when we talk about color schemes compared to some motherboards of 2018 or 2019 with nice RGB lights and so on. But so the motherboard has quite nice heatsink assembly. So the VRM parts that cool the MOSFETs are connected together with the north bridge part and the south bridge part of the motherboard. The north bridge part can be actually water cooled, and if you decide to water cool it, you will eventually cool the entire motherboard with that, as the heat will transfer quite well from the VRMs or from the south bridge, thanks to the quite fairly large heat pipes. And back then it was actually quite wise to water cool the north bridge as well if you were already water cooling the CPU itself, because the north bridge actually runs quite hot and it has a direct impact on how high overclocks you can achieve, as the frontside bus can be limited by the north bridge as well, not just the CPU, and it can also limit how well you can overclock your memory, as the memory controller is located here inside the north bridge, not inside the CPU, as I already said. The P45 motherboards had the newest south bridge chipset on the whole 775 platform. So the south bridge here is the ICH10R, which is exactly the same south bridge as on X58 motherboards. So the X58 motherboards that came in very late 2008 have exactly the same south bridge part as this one here. The X48 or motherboards like the Rampage Extreme, they have the slightly older revision, the ICH9R. So you have some a little bit better connectivity options on P45 compared to X48. So the mainstream chipset on 775 only had 16 PCI Express lanes, so it's exactly the same as today. X48 had more, so on X48 you could run a two-way graphics card solution with both cards running in X16 mode. So this motherboard here has 3 full-length PCI Express slots. The top one is wired X16, the second one is wired X8, and the bottom one is X4. And these are PCI Express 2.0, as P45 supports it out of the box. So this is quite nice for just a single card solution, or you could run two-way crossfire quite fine on this motherboard with both of the cards running in X8 mode. You could technically run two-way SLI on this. Back then SLI was restricted to NVIDIA motherboards only, so that wasn't officially supported, but by hacking it you could actually get two-way SLI to work somehow even on this platform. On top of those there is also a single or PCI Express 1X slot for sound card or similar, and then just 3 normal PCI slots for debug card or Wi-Fi card or similar device. Then there are 4 DDR3 slots. The pink ones are the primary ones with support up to 1900 MHz on paper, but I already mentioned how high numbers I have been able to reach on this particular motherboard. So that is definitely not guaranteed, but it will do 1600 quite well out of the box with command rate 2. Then when just looking at the overall power delivery design, this motherboard has a doubled 6-phase VRM for the V-core, so it's a 12-phase power solution. There are doubling chips at the back side of the motherboard, so it's a doubled 6-phase for the CPU itself. So that is definitely a strong solution when we talk about 775 motherboards overall. The Northbridge power delivery and as well as the memory power delivery is just a dual phase or 2-phase solution, but it is enough for this kind of board. And then when looking at the connectors of this motherboard, there's the 24-pin located here in its normal spot. Next to that is a floppy drive connector. Power to the CPU is fed through a single 8-pin connector. So back then none of the motherboards had a larger option than just a single 8-pin. So back then it didn't really exist that motherboard had 8+4 or dual 8-pin. And many of the low-end motherboards only had a single 4-pin CPU power connector actually, and that is really not enough for a high-end quad-core CPU like the highest-end QX series or the some of the quad-core Xeons that were released to the 771 socket. Here are 6 SATA 2 ports or 3 gigabits per second ports. Debug LED. This was very rare back in those days, so it was very nice that you could actually monitor the whole post process and know immediately what was causing the issue if the board didn't post. Onboard power and reset buttons, also very rare for a motherboard of that era. Normally back in those days people used to use flat-headed screwdrivers to turn on the PC or restart the system, so these are very handy. The motherboard has 2 BIOS chips, also very nice, so less chance for breaking your motherboard with failed BIOS flashes. So they are onboard soldered chips located here. So if you happen to break one of the BIOS chips, the main one, with a failed BIOS flash, you can just revert to the secondary BIOS and reflash the main one with a working one, so you can get it back to life that way. So it's very nice to have. Then here's the IDE connector located here. Here are all the connectors for your case, like hard drive activity LED, case power and reset buttons, and so on. Here at the bottom part of the motherboard, here are 2 internal USB 2 ports for your case, 3 Firewire ports, which is quite a lot, as Firewire doesn't really exist anymore in modern motherboards since like this launch of Sandy Bridge or so. A COM port here and SPDIF port located here near the PCIe slots. So that's pretty much it. The BIOS battery is located in a quite hard location, so under the heatsink assembly. This motherboard has 4 fan connectors, which is of course not much compared to motherboards of today. So one is located here at the bottom part of the motherboard. One is located near the south bridge and the BIOS chips. One just next to the floppy drive connector, and your CPU fan header located at the top part of the motherboard. When looking at the rear I/O of the motherboard, there's an individual PS2 connector for both mouse and keyboard. So individual connector instead of a combo port. Here's your SPDIF optical audio port, and here's your coaxial audio port. A clear CMOS button is also located at the rear I/O of the motherboard. This is a very nice feature for a motherboard of this age, and much more convenient to use than a clear CMOS jumper. A full bank of USB 2.0 ports, so 4 of them are located over here, and additional 2 more located underneath each of the Gigabit Ethernet ports, so this motherboard supports dual LAN. And then lastly, there's your 7.1 HD audio. So that's pretty much it when it comes to the rear I/O of the EP45T-Extreme. It is a nice option for the P45, but I personally just didn't like the mainstream options at all when it comes to 775 motherboards, because they are just so slow and they cannot overclock memory that high. So the mainstream platform was very nice for using with DDR2 memories. With DDR3 it isn't so good, as it cannot really reach 2000 MHz on dual-sided memory or even above that, and the command rate thing is kind of bad when we talk about overclocking and benchmarking in general. But yeah, that's pretty much it. You are lucky if you happen to find one of these on sites like eBay. They will be expensive. This will cost more than Rampage Extreme, for example, on sites like eBay. So 200 euros will be very common for this motherboard model here. It might even cost 300 euros, so it's kind of joke compared to what you get, as this is not a fast motherboard in today's standards. It is only a very rare collector's item. But yeah, if you are really into computers and you like to collect old legendary hardware, you should have this in your collection. So it has its place in the whole in the overclocking world and the history of computer parts. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you like this video, if you like to see more motherboard overviews like this, motherboard overviews of old kind of retro legendary motherboards, I will be doing more. I have Rampage Extreme, Rampage 3 Black Edition, Gigabyte X58 OC, Foxconn Blood Rates, and a few other models I will be covering as well. So if you like this idea, if you like to see the overview of this particular motherboard here in 2019, and you like to hear the background of how hardware has evolved since then and what is the place of this motherboard in the history, then please like and share the video and subscribe to the channel, and see you next time.